疑如何在卷的同时还能安排好家庭生活。请大家继续收看详细内容。欢迎收看华尔街争议，我是你们的主持人。今天我们要讨论的是一个在中国引发广泛关注和热议的话题，那就是年轻人应不应该躺平还是继续卷。这个话题的导火索是北京大学博雅特聘教授、中国经济研究中心主任姚洋的言论。姚洋教授在接受《新京报》采访时提出，年轻人不要躺平，要继续卷，因为只有卷才能成功。这番言论在中国网络上引发了极大反响和争议。让我们首先来看一下这篇文章的具体内容。根据联合早报的报道，姚洋教授在接受采访时表示，专业脱节是个伪命题，特别是对本科来说，大学培养的主要是思维方式。他强调，毕业后所学的知识10%都用不到，企业不应该指望学生毕业后就能立刻上手干活。相反，企业应该允许大学生在工作中逐步培养，成为具有创新能力的人才。接下来，姚洋教授提出了他的核心观点，年轻人不要躺平，要继续卷。他认为，年轻人不能躺，得跟着去卷，只有卷才能出成果，才能成功。你躺平几天，会发现这个世界离你远去。他还补充道，在卷的过程中，只要心态平和，把家庭生活安排好，就能从中找到乐趣。姚洋教授的这些言论在中国社交媒体上迅速引发了热烈讨论，许多网民对他的观点提出了质疑和反对。一些人认为卷和上进并不等同，这种建议是脱离实际的。还有网民质问，什么样的工作既能卷还能把家庭生活安排好？从多个角度来看，我们可以对这篇文章和姚洋教授的观点进行深入分析。首先，从学术和教育的角度分析，姚洋教授谈到的大学教育主要是为了培养学生的思维方式，而非直接应用的专业知识。这一观点确实有其道理。现代高等教育强调的是培养学生的批判性思维和解决问题的能力，而不仅仅是传授具体的技能和知识。这样的教育理念使得学生在面对未来复杂多变的社会环境时能够灵活应对。姚洋教授的这一观点确实反映了一部分教育理论的核心。然而，另一方面，他所提到的毕业后学的东西10%都用不到，也反映了当前教育与实际需求之间的脱节。许多毕业生在进入职场后，面临着知识与工作要求不匹配的问题，这使得他们在职场中需要重新学习和适应，这个过程无疑增加了他们的压力。因此，如何在教育体系中更好地结合理论与实践，可能是一个需要长期探讨的问题。接着，我们从社会心理学的角度来看，姚洋教授提倡的继续卷即不断的努力和竞争，这种观点在中国当前的社会环境下具有一定的现实基础。中国是一个竞争非常激烈的社会，从高考到就业，年轻人面临着巨大的压力。姚洋教授的建议似乎是从现实出发，认为只有在激烈竞争中不断努力，才能取得成功。但是，这种观点也引发了广泛的质疑和反对。许多年轻人认为，长期处于高度紧张和竞争的状态会导致身心疲惫，甚至是心理问题。近年来，躺平一词在网络上流行，反映了一部分年轻人对过度竞争和压力的不满和反抗心理。他们认为，一味的卷不仅不能带来幸福，反而可能导致生活质量的下降和心理健康的问题。因此，如何在竞争与休息之间找到平衡，是许多年轻人关注的焦点。再从经济学的角度来看，姚洋教授的观点也有其支持者。经济学中有一个概念叫做内卷，即在一个系统中，由于资源固定而竞争者增多，导致每个人的努力程度增加，但总体收益并没有显著提高。在这种情况下，不努力的人可能会被淘汰。因此，从经济学的角度，姚洋教授鼓励年轻人继续竞争，似乎是为了在资源有限的环境中确保自身的竞争力。然而，经济学也强调效率和效用最大化。如果一味地追求竞争，而忽视了生活质量和个人幸福感，长期来看，对社会和个人都是不利的。现代经济学更加关注综合的发展，包括经济效益和社会效益。因此，如何在竞争中找到可持续发展的路径，是需要深入思考的问题。最后， 我们从管理学的角度来看，姚洋教授提到，企业不应指望学生毕业后就能立刻上手干活，而是需要给他们时间和机会去培养和发展。这一观点得到了很多企业管理者的认同。现代企业管理强调人才的发展和培养，认为人才是企业最重要的资源。通过系统的培训和发展计划，可以让新员工更好地适应工作环境，发挥他们的潜力。然而，这也需要企业在管理中更加人性化，给予员工更多的支持和理解。企业文化和管理制度需要适应新时代的需求，不能一味地追求短期效益，而忽视了员工的长期发展和幸福感。综合来看，姚洋教授的观点引发了广泛的讨论和反思。我们可以看到，在当前复杂多变的社会环境中，年轻人面临着巨大的压力和挑战。如何在竞争中找到平衡？如何在努力中保持幸福？如何在职业发展中实现个人价值，都是值得深入思考的问题。总的来说，姚洋教授的建议虽然有其现实基础，但也需要考虑到年轻人面临的多重压力和实际困难。作为社会的一员，企业、教育机构和政府都需要共同努力，为年轻人创造更好的发展环境和条件。只有这样，年轻人才能在竞争中找到自己的位置，实现自己的梦想和价值。感谢收看今天的华尔街争议，我是你们的主持人，我们下期再见。俞敏洪在亚布力论坛第10届创新年会上谈内卷，犹如一场热血沸腾的演讲赛，台下的观众无不被他谈笑风生的幽默与深刻见解所吸引。俞老师一上台便开门见山地说道，大家都知道，内卷这个话题，现如今已经成了家常便饭。就像是我们吃饭的时候多加的一勺辣酱，刺激着每一个人的味蕾。他特别提到，中国在很多领域的创新虽然有突破，但很多时候更像是对世界的追赶和模仿，像是一群小学生在老师的背后拼命抄作业，但真正的创造性创新还需要时间来积累。俞敏洪进一步解释，中国人对于新鲜事物的热情，就像是夏天的冰激凌，谁都想多咬上一口。每次有新东西出来，都会引发一轮内卷，比如光伏产业和新能源汽车。追求新发展是一种动力，但它也会带来负面影响。他用一个幽默的比喻来说明这个问题。大家想象一下，我们都在一个长跑比赛中跑得气喘吁吁，但发现前面有一个人骑着自行车，这时你会不会放下手中的书包，直接抢过那辆自行车继续比赛？俞敏洪还提到，中国能否出现像马斯克、乔布斯这样有创新能力的企业家，不仅是企业家的问题，更是生态问题。他特别点赞深圳的多样性和包容性，声称这是这座城市能不断创造出全国性竞争力的原因之一。他说，深圳就像一个大熔炉，吸引着全国各地有才华、有创意、有冒险精神的年轻人。只要这个熔炉不停燃烧，这座城市就会一直充满创新的活力。他用一个风趣的比喻来形容深圳的年轻化。深圳这座城市就像一瓶永远不过期的牛奶，充满了新鲜的生命力。俞敏洪强调，降低年轻人在深圳的创业成本和生态成本，是保持这座城市创新活力的关键。就像我们种花一样，只有土壤肥沃、阳光充足，花儿才能开得更加灿烂。俞敏洪的一番话引起了现场观众的热烈掌声和共鸣，大家纷纷点头表示赞同，甚至有人开玩笑说，俞老师这番话简直就是给大家打了一针鸡血，让我们对未来充满了信心和期待。亚布力论坛的媒体报道也纷纷聚焦俞敏洪的发言。金融界刊登了一篇题为《俞敏洪谈内卷》的文章，文章详细记录了俞敏洪关于内卷与创新的深刻见解。媒体评论称，俞敏洪用他特有的幽默风趣和深刻洞见，为大家展示了一幅中国创新与内卷共存的生动画面。而在社交媒体上，俞敏洪的发言也引起了广泛讨论。网友们纷纷表示，俞敏洪的话不仅让他们对内卷和创新有了更深的理解，更重要的是，他激励了他们在面对挑战时依然保持乐观和进取的心态。一位网友调侃道，俞老师的演讲简直就是一场精神大保健，让我感觉自己瞬间年轻了10岁。总之，俞敏洪在亚布力论坛上关于内卷和创新的发言，既充满了智慧，又不失幽默风趣，成功的将一个复杂的话题变得生动有趣，深深打动了现场观众和广大网友。 他的观点不仅为中国的企业家和年轻人提供了宝贵的启示，也为深圳这座充满活力的城市注入了新的动力和希望。欢迎大家进入六度探索的辩论环节，我们从正反两个角度对本节目进行辩论，请出我们的辩论高手楚天舒、谢琪琪。
我是楚天舒，
我是谢琪琪。
各位朋友，姚洋教授说要继续卷是有道理的。想想历史上那些伟大的成就，哪一个不是通过不断努力和竞争得来的？看看秦朝统一六国，嬴政每天都在卷，让全国人民都卷起来，这才能完成如此壮举。再看看现在，我们的高铁航天事业，哪一项不是通过不断的努力和竞争得来的？所以，年轻人，卷起来吧，卷才有未来。
哎呀，楚天舒，你这可是鸡血打多了。秦始皇卷出个大一统，结果呢？二世而亡。你看看现在，年轻人被卷得连头发都保不住了，哪还有什么创新力？再说，想成就自己的事业，不是得有个好身体吗？天天卷，卷到猝死，卷到脱发，卷到社畜，这人生还有什么乐趣？适当休息，享受生活，才能有创造力。
哎呦，谢琪琪，你这可是典型的佛系啊！你说秦朝亡了，那汉朝又如何？汉武帝卷不卷？他卷出了一个强盛的汉朝，四夷来朝，丝绸之路开通，国力强盛。现代社会也是一样，看看那些成功的创业者，哪一个不是拼命工作？马云、马化腾、雷军，哪个不是每天卷到深夜？你说卷没用，那你干脆搬个椅子晒太阳算了。
楚天舒，你别急呀。你说的那些创业者，他们是成功了，但你看他们的员工，天天加班，工作压力大，幸福指数低。看看1984里，大家都卷的连个自由思想都没有了，社会倒是稳定了，但人还是人吗？创新需要的是自由和包容，而不是单纯的竞争。看深圳，俞敏洪说的对，是多样性和包容性带来了创新，而不是单纯的卷。
谢琪琪，你说的好像卷就等于奴役一样，然而适度的竞争和努力是必要的。就像学习，天天玩游戏，你能考上北大吗？同样的，企业需要竞争才能进步，不然就会被市场淘汰。中国的高科技领域就是因为有竞争，才有了今天的成就。深圳的成功也需要年轻人的拼搏和努力，而不是仅靠包容和多样性。再说了，适度的卷和放松是可以平衡的，关键在于心态和管理。
哼，楚天舒，你这可是站着说话不腰疼啊！你说适度的卷，可现在的社会压力能叫适度吗？天天996，少加班都算你走运。看看日本，大家都在拼命工作，结果呢？自杀率高，过劳死频发。中国要避免这种情况，就得找到平衡。深圳的成功不仅仅靠拼搏，还有政策支持和良好的创业环境。年轻人需要的是机会和空间，而不是被卷得喘不过气来。
谢谢大家收看六度探索，这是一个由科学家、经济学家、媒体人、工程技术人员合作建立的新型媒体，网友与六度 AI 参与合作完成各种内容，这些内容不能作为任何决策或法律的意见。这是一个新型的试验性媒体方式，我们希望得到大家的支持，修正错误。网友可以参与讨论，也可以向万能的六博士提出你能想出的任何问题。六度世界网址是6do world， 请介绍给你的亲朋好友。
想成为全球沟通达人吗？6do 人工智能语音克隆技术帮你实现梦想。在这个新时代，语言障碍已成过去，我们隆重推出6do人工智能语音克隆系统。这项由欧美亚顶尖专家研发的突破性技术， 让你可以克隆自己的声音，并将文字转换成145种语言和方言，提升你的个人和职业生活。想象一下，你可以在日本参加商务会议，在巴西上课，或与意大利的朋友畅聊，而这一切都用你自己的声音、他们的语言进行。操作简单，只需点击几下，无需复杂的科技知识，就能享受无缝衔接的体验，让世界向你敞开。从商务到教育，从媒体到娱乐，应用场景无处不在。企业可以更好地与全球客户建立联系，教育机构可以提供多语言学习，媒体可以创作更丰富的内容，触达更广泛的受众。今天就来体验这项革命性技术吧。访问，迈向你的声音无国界的未来。
大家好，欢迎来到我们的六度探索节目。今天我们将聚焦于中国国家主席习近平最近的重大呼吁。他在北京的科技会议上强调，中国科学家应在高科技战场上加强创新，特别是在集成电路、工业机床、基础软件、高级材料、科学研究仪器和种源这6大关键领域取得突破。习近平指出，技术革命与超级大国的角力密不可分，而高科技领域正成为主要战场。随着中美科技战的加剧，习近平强调技术自力更生和创新对中国未来发展的重要性。请大家继续收看详细内容。大家好，欢迎来到六度解析，我是你们的主持人。今天我们要讨论的是习近平主席在最近一次科技会议上发表的重要讲话。这篇文章来自南华早报，由驻北京记者 Jin Kai 报道。文章详细介绍了习近平对中国科研人员的号召，特别是在高科技领域的创新所需的突破。在北京的一次科技会议上，习近平主席呼吁中国的科研人员在6个关键领域加强创新，他将这些领域称为超级大国竞争中的主战场，以保证中国的供应链安全。习近平指出，应该重点在集成电路、工业机床、基础软件、先进材料、科研仪器和种子源等瓶颈技术上取得突破。习近平的讲话通过新华社向外界发布。他提到，中国已经在从太空到深海探索等多个领域取得了显著的科学进步，但他也指出，在原始创新方面的能力相对较弱，一些核心技术受制于其他国家，并且存在技能短缺的问题。他强调，要具备更强的紧迫感，加强创新，以占据未来技术竞争的制高点。这种呼吁正值中美开始激烈的科技战之际。美国已经阻止了先进半导体以及相关技术和知识的销售，这些芯片对于人工智能技术的发展至关重要。美国财政部上周表示，正提议新规限制对可能对美国国家安全构成威胁的技术的对外投资，而中国被列为关注国家。在中美科技争霸日益激烈的背景下，习近平频频强调科技自立自强和创新的重要性，北京也希望通过这些措施推动长期的经济增长。在周一的会议上，习近平向大约3000名科学家和研究人员发表了讲话，并阐述了他的期望。他表示，中国应该具备强大的基础研究和原始创新能力，并能够持续产生重要的、原始的和颠覆性的科技成果，从而深刻重塑全球秩序和发展格局。习近平还强调了高质量发展和高水平安全所需的技术，并指出应关注人工智能、量子科学、生物技术等新兴技术领域。此外，他谈到了中国在国际科学和创新领域发挥领导作用的雄心壮志，并承诺通过全国家系统来改善基础研究的资金支持，激励科学家并促进国际合作。北京今年已拨款约980亿元人民币用于基础研究，比2023年增长了13%。相比之下，美国联邦政府今年的基础研究预算为486亿美元，比2023年增加了10亿美元。习近平表示，随着国际环境日益复杂，我们应敞开心扉，进一步扩大开放。我们应协调开放和安全的需求，实现自力更生和自我完善。在会议期间，习近平还颁发了国家最高科学奖。武汉大学的卫星成像专家李德仁和深圳南方科技大学的量子物理学家薛其坤获得了国家最高科学技术奖。 现在，让我们从不同角度来深入分析和评论习近平的讲话及其背景。首先，从全球科技竞争的角度来看，习近平的讲话无疑是对近年来中美科技战加剧的回应。美国针对中国的高科技禁运和投资限制措施，凸显了西方国家对中国快速崛起的担忧。习近平的讲话明确指出，中国希望通过加强自主创新，减少对外部技术的依赖，以应对这种外部压力。其次，从中国国内科技发展的角度来看，习近平提出的6个关键领域，无疑是当前中国科技发展的瓶颈。这些领域的技术突破，不仅关系到国家安全，也关系到未来经济发展的核心竞争力。特别是在集成电路和基础软件领域，国内企业仍然面临着巨大的技术短板，因此国家层面的政策支持和科研投入显得尤为重要。再来看，这种大国竞争背景下的创新策略，不仅是为了应对短期的国际压力，更是为了实现长期的自力更生。习近平提到的全国家系统支持，显示了中国在科技投入上的制度优势。尽管与美国的基础研究预算相比仍有差距，但中国正在通过集中资源、激励政策和国际合作，逐步缩小这一差距。最后，从国际合作的角度来看，习近平虽然强调自力更生，但他并未完全拒绝国际合作。相反，他提出了敞开心扉、扩大开放的建议。这表明，中国在追求技术自主的同时，仍希望通过国际合作和交流，获取更多的创新资源和经验。总结来看，习近平在此次科技会议上的讲话，反映了中国在面对国际科技竞争中的紧迫感和决心。通过加强自主创新和国际合作，中国希望在高科技领域取得突破，从而在未来的国际竞争中占据有利位置。这不仅关系到国家的技术安全和经济发展，也关系到全球科技格局的重塑。以上就是今天6度解析的全部内容，谢谢收看，我们下期再见。谢谢大家收看6度探索，这是一个由科学家、经济学家、媒体人、工程技术人员合作建立的新型媒体，网友与6度 AI 参与合作完成各种内容，这些内容不能作为任何决策或法律的意见。这是一个新型的试验性媒体方式，我们希望得到大家的支持，修正错误。网友可以参与讨论，也可以向万能的6博士提出你能想出的任何问题。6度世界网址是6do world， 请介绍给你的亲朋好友。
I'm going to talk a little bit about the Indo-Pacific and whether the increased focus on the Indo-Pacific can be sustained as we are buffeted by both domestic challenges and other challenges on the international scene. Now, many of you with us today and joining us online are yourselves leaders in the national security community, the people who have helped shape and drive much of the U.S. policy that we are discussing today. So with that backdrop and in the spirit of this new initiative, I'd like to offer a few words about a central strategic priority for President Biden, National Security Advisor Sullivan, Secretary Blinken, and that is making U.S. strategic engagement in the Indo-Pacific region long-lasting and enduring. Now, it seems like that would be a simple proposition, but it's one that we've been challenged by time and time again. It's not a new task, and indeed, for decades, there had been a growing recognition that American foreign policy must better account for the opportunities and challenges of the Indo-Pacific region. Yet, even as strategists acknowledge this underlying imperative, multiple administrations have struggled to realize it, and especially to sustain it over the long term with resources, time, focus, and attention. That is not to say the U.S. presence in the region has been modest or that it is recent. The United States has been an Indo-Pacific power for over 2 centuries. Our treaty alliances with Indo-Pacific powers, Australia, Japan, the Republic of Korea, the Philippines, and Thailand stretch back 70 years and longer. and our deep economic and people-to-people ties still further back. But efforts to step up our ambition from this strong foundation have too often proved episodic. A platform that has bred conventional wisdom that U.S. momentum in the Indo-Pacific lasts only until the next crisis elsewhere pulls our focus away from these strong, important endeavors. 3.5 years into the Biden administration, I would simply put to you that this time is different, and it's different by design. Today, the structure of our Indo-Pacific engagement is durable, anchoring the United States in the region for the long haul. The best proof of that durability is very recent history. As wars rage in Central Europe and the Middle East, our commitment to the Indo-Pacific has withstood those tests of resolve and focus. I want to describe what I think are the elements of an enduring approach. 3 fundamentals ground our approach, and we believe give it staying power over the long run. First, the case for greater U.S. engagement in the Indo-Pacific has a clear strategic focus than it ever did in the past, and certainly more so than a decade ago. The region is home to more than half of the world's people, nearly 2/3 of the world's economy, and several of the world's rising powers. Its economies drive more than 60% of all global growth and are the world's hub for trade, manufacturing, and innovation. The region also supports more than 3 million American jobs and has provided nearly $900 billion in foreign direct investment in the United States, much of that relatively recently given opportunities in technology. During the Biden administration, Indo-Pacific allies and partners, once considered destinations for American offshoring, have instead committed to invest more than $200 billion in an American manufacturing renaissance in fields from semiconductors to batteries. At the same time, the region is a source of significant risk. PRC's military buildup, which we've already heard about, the biggest ever undertaken in peacetime, is upsetting the regional balance. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea continues its provocations, and Beijing's military provocations in the South and East China Sea, seen starkly at Second Thomas Shoal this past week, as well as across the line of actual control with India, and especially in and around the Taiwan Strait, could spark conflicts that would devastate the global economy. The world depends on supply chains and commercial flows, such as Taiwan's semiconductors, that run through the Indo-Pacific and, if interrupted, could cause a global Great Depression. Meanwhile, the region is critical to addressing transnational challenges like climate and disease. The Biden administration's assessment that China is the only country with both the intent to reshape the international order and increasingly the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to do so is widely shared. What happens in the region will affect all Americans and the people of many of our allies and partners around the world. So in the past, while there had been questions about whether the focus on the Indo-Pacific was appropriate, given pressing challenges elsewhere, I think there's a recognition now that a large share of the history of the 21st century will play out in the Indo-Pacific. Second proposition, the United States is not alone in this effort. The United States is deeply engaged with other nations within the Indo-Pacific and beyond it in stepping up our game there. Revitalizing our alliances and partnerships has been at the center of the Biden administration's approach to foreign policy. In fact, if you ask me what would be the Biden doctrine, it would be stepping up partnerships with allies and friends. These partnerships are distinct from those of the past, and it is evident the structure of American engagement in the Indo-Pacific is maturing. Historically, the United States followed a model with the U.S. hub, allied and partners spokes. That approach depended on Washington's initiative and could not easily be scaled. Now, Indo-Pacific engagements involve unique constellations, what Ambassador Emanuel in Tokyo calls a lattice work, that set the agenda on issues ranging from semiconductors to security cooperation to maritime domain awareness. These structures allow the United States to move faster, reduce the risk of veto players, root itself in the region, and share burdens. Through creative partnerships and effective personal diplomacy, President Biden has achieved diplomatic victories that once seemed impossible, blue sky ideas. In his first multilateral summit as president, he brought together the Quad, Australia, Japan, and India and the United States for the first ever leaders meeting. Last summer, President Biden hosted Prime Minister Kishida of Japan, President Yoon of the Republic of South Korea at Camp David, where they made ambitious pledges of cooperation despite decades of painful history between our two closest friends in Northeast Asia. The president also launched AUKUS with Australia and the UK, the first time in 70 years that the United States has taken steps to provide an ally a nuclear-powered submarine capability. By its nature, AUKUS is a serious and long-term commitment for each of the partner countries to one another and to the Indo-Pacific region. And the United States and India have launched an effort to intensify defense industrial cooperation on jet engines and armored vehicles. After working on India for decades, I can tell you that it is my view that finally the U.S.-India relationship has reached escape velocity. I think we have a partnership that can be sustaining, and there is ambition in both Delhi and Washington to take important next steps. We've worked together on a variety of other issues between the United States and India, including announcing new initiatives where we will work together for the first time in the Indian Ocean. Not to mention greater access for bombers in Australia, a Marine Littoral Regiment in Okinawa, access to 4 new strategic locations in the Philippines, and opportunities for access in Papua New Guinea. So multifaceted activities across the Indo-Pacific. Consistent with the One China policy, the Biden administration has expanded foreign military sales to Taiwan and added novel innovations like foreign military financing and the use of presidential drawdown authority to strengthen deterrence against increasing PRC provocations in and around the Strait. 5 years ago, when we had challenges across the Taiwan Strait, it would often be one country that would issue a diplomatic note or would speak out publicly in support of our friends in Taiwan. Today, the Biden administration has encouraged record numbers of states to call for peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, literally dozens. None of this would be possible without allied and partner support. All of it plays a role in deterrence. On economics and technology, I'm thrilled to hear that Mike's going to focus on this. This is probably the most important effort that we need to focus on going forward. A critical part of the administration's approach has been novel initiatives with allies and partners from ISET, the U.S.-India Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies. And last week, I accompanied Jake Sullivan to India for those furthering talks to trilateral coordination with Japan and the Republic of Korea on semiconductors and batteries to quantum computing. This is on top of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF, with 13 regional economies, including a first-of-its-kind IPEF supply chain agreement. The United States is not only receiving greater investment from the Indo-Pacific, it also remains the largest source of foreign direct investment in the region and around the globe, outpacing the PRC. Our engagements weave the Indo-Pacific and European partners together. In the past, we had a tendency to view these theaters as separate and at times in conflict. Increasingly, there are signs of profound integration between these two important theaters. The last time I served at the State Department over a decade ago, the pivot was sometimes misunderstood as a sign that the United States was turning away from Europe to Asia, something that, frankly, I've tried to say publicly was our mistake in the rollout. The truth is everything that we've ever done of consequence on the global stage, we have done with European partners, and I expect that to continue. And there can be no misunderstanding this time that the administration is increasingly and explicitly working with Europe on the Indo-Pacific. It was only in 2016 that the EU recognized the Indo-Pacific as a strategic priority. Now the Biden administration holds annual consultations with Europe on the Indo-Pacific. In fact, we've held dozens Indo-Pacific dialogues with our European partners in every part of the continent. Several European countries now have Indo-Pacific strategies of their own, and key players that are involved in Southeast Asia and the Pacific as they step up their games there as well. European governments are also aligning their approaches on the protection of critical technology and on de-risking and diversifying supply chains with the United States. European engagement not only complements American involvement, it also creates partnership and momentum that ensures the United States remains active in the Indo-Pacific. The proof of effectiveness is that the PRC and Russia view our cross-continental partnerships with growing concern. And it's why they see the alliance and partner systems as a singular American asymmetric advantage, which we intend to continue. Third and last, a bipartisan approach. There is largely bipartisan agreement about the essential features of the American strategy in the Indo-Pacific. You're going to hear from my friend, Matt Pottinger. Later, he'll have his own views, but overall, the sense of common purpose between the executive and legislative branches has been unmistakable in recent years. Members of both parties are keenly aware of past episodes of strategic distraction, as well as of the region's critical role in American prosperity and security. I think at the core of that is a belief that not only do we have to increase our own capabilities through investment in technologies, but working closely with allies and partners can help manifest them. Congressional delegations have visited the region to great effect in recent years, including Senator Schumer's bipartisan delegation to China, which helped open space for cooperation on counter narcotics late last year. I just met with a bipartisan House delegation in India led by HFAC Chairman McCall and Ranking Member Meeks, along with Speaker Emeritus Pelosi, as they engaged closely with Indian friends and partners on next steps. New congressional committees, including the Bipartisan Select Committee on China, are sustaining that focus, while new congressional caucuses on other Indo-Pacific states have expanded dramatically in recent years. Members of Congress have also publicly expressed bipartisan support for major administration initiatives such as AUKUS, the Quad, the IP4, AP4, and security assistance for Taiwan. I will also say we try to also note that as we build these policies, we build on the foundations of previous administrations, including important work of the Trump administration. The Compact of Free Association Agreements, maintaining the U.S. commitments to the Republic of Palau, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and the Federated States of Micronesia, passed with bipartisan support earlier this year. I would just note that this is an environment where literally nothing passed. The only thing that went through was this agreement that basically allowed us to continue our important relationship with these three key states of the Northern Pacific. And much of the key domestic legislation Congress has passed, which is historic in nature, such as the CHIPS and Science Act, had a clear Indo-Pacific rationale as well. So the key will be now staying the course. Over the last 3 years, the world has faced significant challenges outside the Indo-Pacific. But even in the immediate weeks and months after Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine or Hamas's attack on Israel, when top-level time and attention was scarcest, the administration kept up its focus on the region. And this is important. At that time, in the immediate aftermath, President Biden did a number of things. He hosted the first U.S.-ASEAN Leaders Summit in Washington, D.C., traveled to Korea and Japan, and joined a Quad Leaders Summit to launch the Indo-Pacific Maritime Domain Awareness Initiative. He hosted Australia's Prime Minister for a historic state visit, convened Asia-Pacific leaders at APEC, and met PRC President Xi Jinping for a full day of meetings that unlocked cooperation on counter-narcotics, a restoration of military diplomacy, and an effort to stabilize bilateral relations going forward. We're also institutionalizing an Indo-Pacific focus at the State Department. In the last 18 months, with congressional support, Secretary Blinken stood up a new Office of China Coordination, or what we call inside the State Department, our China House, to prioritize coordination with allies and partners on China across our work worldwide. The Biden administration also understands that three theaters, Europe, the Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific, are increasingly intertwined. The PRC, Russia, DPRK, and Iran are increasing coordination and security cooperation. I would say that the two countries that have done the most to support Russia's reconstitution of its defense industrial base since its first failed steps at an invasion in Ukraine have unquestionably been China and North Korea. In return, Russia is supporting advances in the military programs of all three of these partners. Indeed, Vladimir Putin visited the Democratic People's Republic of Korea for the first time in 20 years last week. There are limits to these partnerships, but they cannot be ignored. Our partners in the Indo-Pacific are not ignoring them. Skeptics sometimes call for a sharp reduction in U.S. support to Ukraine, even though this would free up no meaningful new outlays for Taiwan. An abrupt cessation of U.S. support to Ukraine would not only be a moral failure, it would be a strategic one too, not just in Europe, but in the Indo-Pacific. Far from a clever strategic readjustment eastward, friends and adversaries would see it as evidence that American political paralysis is eroding U.S. credibility and resolve as a security partner. It is a profound shift that our Indo-Pacific friends are standing up to support European security. I must underline this. Hugely different from a previous pattern when Asia-Pacific partners, Indo-Pacific partners would often sit on the sidelines for major developments. I think this was most visibly on display when Prime Minister Kishida addressed a joint session of Congress here in the United States in April. It was a critical moment in our country for security assistance to Ukraine. As you recall then, it had been months, no movement on the bill to increase, again, send American support to Ukraine. Many in Congress expressed surprise that Prime Minister Kishida's first point was on Ukraine, and that victory for Ukraine or avoiding defeat is an essential prerequisite for maintaining peace and security in the Indo-Pacific. Many of those same members of Congress who were reluctant before cited the Prime Minister's words as moving and decisive in restarting U.S. security assistance for Ukraine. In closing, it is that cross and interregional perspective among allies and partners that is at the core of the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy. We have sustained U.S. engagement by expanding the array of stakeholders committed to a free and open Indo-Pacific. It is not just a whole of government project. It is a whole of society project, one that requires vibrant public scholarship and dialogue like this. The China Strategy Initiative will no doubt contribute much to that effort. And I just want to say that we will try to bring the resources of the State Department and the government to bear in assisting this important work take hold. I do want to just say how much I appreciate the opportunity to be here. It's nice to be able to see two friends do so well. I'm grateful for the opportunity to play a small role in its launch today. Thank you very much. Do you want me to sit here? You want me to sit here? Is it? You want me to sit here? Okay. Thanks.
Don't sit here. Okay.
Got it.
Thanks very much for that, Kurt. Let's start maybe with the your overall thrust on the rebalancing towards Asia.
Yeah.
Recently, one of our senior fellows, Bob Blackwell, Richard Fontaine from CNAS, published a book called The Lost Decade, U.S. Pivot to Asia and the Rise of Chinese Power. They give you a lot of credit for coming up with the idea of the pivot to Asia or the rebalancing towards Asia. But as the title suggests, they basically think it was a failure. Do you agree with that assessment? And why did you fail?
So I have seen the book, and I had a chance to participate in some of the interviews, and I would call and count Richard Fontaine as one of my closest, dearest friends. So we often talk about how important it is for Chinese strategists and friends to basically define the past, to write the history in ways that then validate certain things about the way forward. And I would just simply say that China is not unique in this. I found parts of the book recognizable and part of it just very different from my own experience. I think the argument is somehow made in a vacuum. I think and so parts of the book suggest that this was the biggest strategic failure of the last 50 years, the inability to marshal all the necessary resources to fully engage and develop a fundamental strategy in the Indo-Pacific. I think it tends to forget that some of the key challenges that we were facing at the time were the aftermaths of the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, and really just enormous, pressing, enduring challenges in the Middle East and South Asia. Now, I would also say both of them, I think Blackwell and Richard Fontaine, terrific public servants, both deeply engaged in that endeavor. I would say that the key often with new major initiatives is that they rarely begin in a smooth fashion. They will often go through starts and stops. I do think there was important work done in previous administrations on the Indo-Pacific at the beginning of the Bush administration before the swerve to the Middle East and South Asia. I think there was a recognition of the importance of the Indo-Pacific. They put people like Rich Armitage at the State Department, lots of focus on how to see the way forward there. I think there was unquestionably a detour. And I think we are very well aware of that now, given the other pressing challenges that we're facing. So, I think it's an important book in the sense that it, offers a different perspective. But I think it has to be read in the context of sort of a larger effort of how to understand how we ended up for 20 years devoting a dramatic share of our national resources, of our time and attention in initiatives in the Middle East and South Asia that I think historically look to be not the best investments.
Let's go to the here and now. We have a real risk of escalation right now in the Philippines between ourselves, the Philippines, and China. The Chinese seem to be testing us, how far they can go with their Coast Guard, their water cannons, other activity, how far they can go without triggering our reaction. If there is a loss of life, will the U.S. come to the Philippines' defense?
So, Mike, I think our senior officials have been very clear about what circumstances we would consider that the treaty between the United States and the Philippines would come into play. And we've had close consultations with the Philippines about those circumstances. I do think it's important to say, Mike, that the Philippines are very cautious at this juncture. They do not seek a crisis with China. They are seeking dialogue, they're seeking discussion, and they want the United States to be purposeful with other allies and partners about our goals to maintain peace and stability and to send a very clear message of deterrence and reassurance, and we have done so. We've had very close consultations since with the Philippines. We've taken some private steps. I'm not going to go through everything here.
You're among friends.
I know. We've also significantly demarched the Chinese interlocutors. The challenge in circumstances like this, it is often the case that each player believes the other is testing them. And so I don't think China is, I don't think we are alone in feeling that we are being tested here. So the most important thing in this time frame is to be resolute, to be very clear publicly in our support for the Philippines, to draw very clear public and private lines of what we believe is essential for the maintenance of peace and stability, and then follow through on that. And I will just say that we are in another manifestation of the strategy that we described. 10 or 15 years ago, this would only be a dialogue between the United States and the Philippines. We're literally in consultations with over a dozen countries about shared approaches to maintain peace and stability there.
As you mentioned in your remarks, the strengthening of the Quad, the launch of AUKUS, the trilateral Camp David summit with Japan and South Korea, all are directed towards really institutionalizing this focus and commitment to the Indo-Pacific. Let's talk about the Korea piece in particular. By the way, I understand there's Camp David, but then there was a mini summit at your farm with the two vice ministers from Japan and Korea. You want to talk about
that's probably
what did you serve? Did you cook? Camp Campbell?
So it was since the Camp David meeting, just to underscore the importance of this, before that smattering of meetings trilaterally, since Camp David, there have been over 50 major initiatives between the three countries in a range of areas, Mike, and we wanted to take stock of that at the vice minister level. I'm close to both of the delegations. These guys work relentlessly, so we thought it would be nice to have a meeting in a place that we were outside and could then enjoy each other a little bit. So we had a wonderful session in which we reviewed all the different steps that we were taking, concern about what was happening with Russia and North Korea, how to plan ahead for what steps that we might take trilaterally. And then we were able to enjoy some good Southern Virginia barbecue and
ultimate Frisbee, or
not so much that, a little singing, a little uncomfortable singing, but still. Yeah.
So just to build on your comments earlier about Putin's visit to North Korea, we certainly are a far distance from the days of the six-party talks when we're working with China and Russia to put pressure on North Korea. Do you expect, as part of this defense pact, Russia to provide North Korea with nuclear support for their program? How do you think China feels about that? And with South Korea now saying they may consider providing lethal aid to Ukraine, how are these two theaters converging?
Yeah, so there are a lot of questions there, Mike. Let me try to take a couple of them if I can. So first, I think we have seen a dramatic step up in the relationship between Moscow and Pyongyang. And we know that that North Korea has provided an enormous amount of 155, or they're slightly different caliber shells for Russia's war effort in Ukraine, some long-range missiles and other capabilities, literally train loads and other ships coming to Russia. We believe that that there are discussions about what North Korea gets in exchange, and they could be associated with its nuclear or long-range missile development plans, perhaps other things in energy and the like. I think we're studying in the aftermath of the agreement and watching carefully, but we are concerned. I had a call last night with the South Koreans about our next steps in terms of steps that we will take to step up deterrence more clearly. I think it is fair to say that China is somewhat anxious about what's going on between Russia and North Korea. They have indicated so in some of our interactions, and we can see some tension associated with those things. And so, you know, it's fascinating, Mike, even though Russia and China are working very closely together in Ukraine, and I would argue that it is a deep strategic partnership, one which we have historically gotten wrong on both sides. And it is undeniably a defining feature in global politics today. But there are tensions. There are tensions in the Arctic. There are tensions in the stands, the countries that have traditionally been closer to Russia, but increasingly economically, commercially attracted to China. And now we're seeing them on North Korea. And I think it would be fair to say that China is probably worried that North Korea will be somehow encouraged to take provocative steps that could lead to a crisis in Northeast Asia. And so we're watching carefully. You've seen some movements across the DMZ that have led to, kind of brief exchanges of fire. We've seen really provocative language on the part of North Korea that suggests a juncture in which they no longer seek unification. They are basically redefining their role in global politics. And we've also seen a recurring pattern of absolute clear determination to avoid diplomacy with the United States, Japan, or South Korea on any terms. And so, yes, this is a dangerous set of developments, and one that we're watching and engaged on very closely.
Let's talk about that relationship between China and Russia. The Biden administration was quite effective in warning China that if they provided lethal aid to Russia for its war in Ukraine, it would be subject to some significant action by the U.S., sanctions or otherwise. And as far as we know, as far as the public reporting is, China's gone right up to the line in terms of providing components, satellite imagery, rocket fuel, other things to aid the Russians' military-industrial complex, but not yet lethal aid. Why not move the goalposts? If that concerns us, the support that China is providing Russia, why not say unless they stop providing those components, we're going to take action and impose sanctions, since the threat of sanctions seems to be quite effective there?
Well, Mike, I would simply say that I think we've done exactly that. And if you've seen last week, we have taken particular steps at dozens of Chinese firms that are involved in the endeavor to support Russia's military-industrial complex. One of the companies is quite large and has been involved in a variety of the things, some of which you've described, including providing precursor things for explosives and semiconductors that are used for long-range munitions. And so I think we've sought to take those steps. I think what's most important, though, Mike, is that Russia is quite attentive to what the European view of this is. And I think in some respects, they are misreading what is happening in Europe. My own belief is that in large parts of Europe, there is a dawning strategic realization of some of the strategic challenges that China poses, not just in the Indo-Pacific, but peace and stability in Europe as a whole. Let's recall the kinds of developments that we've seen as Russia reconstitutes. They provide an enormous challenge in the short term to Ukraine, but no matter what happens, they will provide a long-term challenge to peace and stability in Europe. And so countries in Europe are going to have to deal with this for decades to come. And so China is involved indirectly, and I would say intimately, in an effort to basically change the nature of territorial lines and military balances in the Indo-Pacific. That is core to our strategic purpose, and also to the aspirations and strategic assessments of our partners in Europe. We tend to focus more publicly on statements that somehow suggest ambivalence on the part of Europeans to this growing reality. But I will tell you, I was at the NAC 3 weeks ago in Brussels in NATO, and have had deep consultations with NATO partners. This is a challenge that is now well understood and recognized. And I think if you look at the itinerary of President Xi's visit to Europe a couple of weeks ago, it gives you an indication that they themselves probably understand the nature of some of these debates. I mean, I don't know, France, Hungary, and Slovakia is kind of an unusual, it's like a grouping of nations, but these are the three places that I think President Xi felt that he had some ability to make his case or not to be challenged. But even in private meetings in France, I think President Macron was very clear about some of the concerns that Europe as a whole is facing. And so China's entry into the strategic calculations of Europe is unmistakable. It is without question one of the more important developments in recent times. We have tried to urge and underscore to Chinese policymakers and diplomats how dangerous this is and how it risks the maintenance of stable and good relations, not just with us, but Europe as a whole.
At the same time, the Europeans have been very reluctant just to fall in line behind the U.S. in its China policy, whether it's the discussion of strategic autonomy by President Macron and others, or just this last weekend, I believe, a German minister calling for a differentiated approach on economic policy towards China for Europe from the United States. How it's one thing to try and convince the Europeans that China is creating a threat to their security. You mentioned that the Indo-Pacific is now focused, like Kishida, on Ukraine. If something were to happen in Taiwan, would you expect our European allies to be with us on that?
So I'm not sure. First of all, just to go back with your proposition about countries getting in line, I think it would be fair to say that both of our strategic perspectives have been enriched by continuing deep engagement between the United States and various European partners and friends. Our views evolve in that process, and we see that happening in Europe as well. We tend to focus on the one or two statements of European ministers or leaders that appear out of sync. I would also just have you take a look at some of the strategic documents coming out of NATO, some of the magnificent speeches that von der Leyen has provided about how the EU sees challenges in the Indo-Pacific and with respect to China. I think most of those suggests that the overall balance is in favor of an increasing alignment. I will say, though, Mike, there are increasing and existing tensions on trade and technology between the United States and Europe, just as there are between China and Europe. It's very important for us that we work closely with partners in Europe to ease those tensions where possible, to seek where we can cooperate where necessary. And so I see the situation slightly differently, having worked on dialogues with Europe on the Indo-Pacific for decades now. They are unrecognizable today, much closer, much greater intimacy. I think what we have seen is a large number of countries, Mike, indicate that they have a strong interest in the maintenance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. Now, that is meant to be a careful step to signal a desire to deter aggression and sustain the status quo. I do believe that there is a large group of European nations that align with the view that it is better to maintain peace and stability, that the status quo has served its purposes for decades and it can continue to do so, and that they would seek to take those steps going forward. In terms of talking about scenarios and situations in the future, I think, Mike, we are better off not ruminating about those things.
Let me open it up now for questions from the audience. Just a reminder, we're on the record. Please stand, wait for a microphone, identify yourself, and ask a brief question in the form of a question, not a statement. Let's go way in the back there. Third row from the end. Is there a microphone? There we go.
Good morning, Dimitri from the Financial Times. Kurt, how close do you think we are to the Philippines or the US invoking the Mutual Defense Treaty? And if that happened, what would the significance be?
Dimitri, as you probably know, I'm not going to speculate on that here in public. I will say we have reaffirmed its significance and its relevance to these situations continually and at the highest level, the President, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State. So we've sent a clear and unambiguous message of our determination to stand by our Philippine friends. I will say also just we are experiencing, in many respects, Dimitri, I think you know this, you've visited, you've seen it on the ground, a renaissance in U.S.-Philippine relations in which the people-to-people, the diplomatic, the military, every element of our bilateral relations has increased dramatically in recent months, and we are encouraged by that more generally.
Great. Right here in the second row.
Thank you very much. My name is Alice Zhang. I'm a China/Taiwan subject matter expert for Indo-Pacific Command. And my question is, you mentioned a lot about the European partnerships that we have with the US. Are there any efforts that we're putting forward to facilitate a synchronized messaging for any actions? For example, what just happened in Second Thomas Show, and synchronize the messaging with our partners and allies in the region?
It's a great question. And I think this is an area that we believe is fruitful for more work. In the last few years, we have stepped up dramatically our cooperation in cybersecurity. Many of the countries in Europe, like in the Indo-Pacific, are subject to deep penetration and challenges that are both from non-state actors, but also from Russia and China. We have endeavored to support those efforts at sharing respective experiences and ways to harden our systems. We've also worked intensively on disinformation, which I think if you ask me what is the thing that concerns me the most, it is the effectiveness of disinformation in a variety of places. It is not just the case that we face it in Europe and Ukraine, we face it globally, and those narratives are dangerous, penetrating, and difficult to counter. We are now launching a number of initiatives with European states and others to help, how we address some of those issues. And yes, you will see messaging that is purposeful and determined. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but we'll be hosting the NATO 75th anniversary here in Washington in less than a month. The leaders of the AP4 representatives will be here to highlight the increasing connectivity between the Indo-Pacific and Europe, and I believe we'll have some things to say about our shared views and perspectives. There's much work to be done here, and I do think that the key here, I think the most important ingredient in the effectiveness of this strategy is working closely with allies and partners. And I would just say this gets back to the point that Mike makes. In many respects, it is not really about other countries getting in line, for instance, or getting in some respects, it's going to involve the United States changing the way that we do business. I will tell you some of the most interesting things that are happening right now, for instance, in the US-Japan relationship, or Japan demanding changes in the way that we have operated for decades in the Indo-Pacific, or operated with in the context of our bilateral military relationship, and they want innovations. And that challenges us bureaucratically in important ways. I see my friend here from the Australian embassy. We want to do these important work with Australia. Australia demands that Australia be treated like a prized ally, and that certain sort of bureaucratic hurdles be eased to allow for the kind of consequential technological military cooperation that is necessary. And so to make this these partnerships effective, it is not just countries getting behind the United States, although a little of that does make you feel good at times. It is also the fact that this has to be part of a partnership in which the United States listens, is attentive to other countries' legitimate national and international perspectives and concerns. And so the hope is, no matter what happens in the United States politically, is that effort will continue. I will just say one of the things that I have found interesting. I think it is clear that across the Indo-Pacific, there are uncertainties about what happens next in American domestic politics. But rather than pulling back, I see most strategic partners investing more in the United States, largely because they recognize that an essential ingredient in any global effort at resilience or purposeful defense necessarily involves the United States, and creating and sustaining momentum matters in any political domestic context in the United States or elsewhere.
For our next question, we're going to go to our virtual audience.
We'll take the next question from Fred Hochberg.
Hi, Kurt. Hi, Mike.
Hi, Fred.
What can we do to pull China away from a Russia, North Korea, Iran axis? Is there some carrots that we could deploy? Because otherwise, it just seems too easy, particularly with political sentiment in this country, for them to just keep getting closer and closer to those other three rogue countries.
So, Fred, first of all, thank you for the question. So I will say I think there is sometimes a view among foreign policy practitioners that somehow we forced China into Russia's arms. And I don't think we've fully recognized how much a national project this has been on the part primarily of Xi Jinping, but also of President Putin. Since coming to power, they've met over 50 times, hundreds and hundreds of hours, enormous numbers of exchanges. You can find in both of their systems senior people that are ambivalent about the other, but I don't think that's had any impact on a dramatic alignment, strategic alignment between the two that is driven at the leader level. We know a little bit about the nature of some of those discussions, how they're prepared. I think if you take a look at the no holds barred statement, it is remarkable. It combines elements of sort of 1950s ideology and 1930s territorial ambition. And it's quite daunting in its breadth and ambition. I would simply say that in their private deliberations at the top levels, both leaders, Fred, and people around them take an enormous amount of time to focus on how and whether the United States and other countries will come at them to try to split them. And so they are very attentive to any efforts to try to create tension between the two countries. They see it when we try to employ it, and they try to steel themselves to it. I think ultimately my own view, Fred, is that this is a partnership that has enormous challenges, maybe not now. It is definitely aligned by a deep sense of antagonism towards Western interference, American perfidy, a belief that we are involved in efforts at sustained regime change globally. And that has been a hugely strongly shared view between the two countries and the two leaders more directly. However, the changes in the balance of power, China is much larger now in a better strategic position. I think there will likely in the future be a resurgence of tension between Moscow and Beijing, but it's impossible to predict what that situation looks like in decades. Right now, that alignment is powerful, it's sustaining, and it's had a huge impact on the battlefields of Europe more directly. And I think given how much China has supported Russia, there have always been certain technologies and capabilities that Russia withheld from its partnership with China, even in periods of enormous intimacy. Given how much China has recently stepped up, one has to be concerned that certain capabilities that Russia still has advantages in submarines, and that they're potentially part of the barter or bargain between China and Russia.
Yes, the woman on the aisle there. Thank you.
Hi, Chris with the Joint Staff. Kurt, you mentioned resumption of military relations with China in your remarks earlier. What is this administration's vision for mil-mil relations? What have we learned from over 40 years of on and off mil-mil contacts? And how does that inform what we want to achieve differently this time, or how we're going to approach it moving forward? Thank you.
I'm glad we could facilitate interagency dialogue between DOD and the State Department here at the Council on Foreign Relations.
It's nice to see you, Chris. It's been many years. Nice to see you. Thank you for the question. So you're right. The mil-to-mil relationship has had several periods over the course of the last 30 or 40 years. And I think we've learned lessons in that process. I think what we think is most important now are a few high-level discrete engagements that are designed to do a number of things. First, to just make sure that we have open lines of communication and are able to convey important messages to China. Secretary Austin met his counterpart at Shangri-La, was able to have a strong strategic engagement. We expect and look forward to Admiral Paparo engaging one of his counterparts next year at some point. I think what we seek are efforts to explore our strategy, their strategy, issues associated with deployments, what are their animating beliefs in certain regional circumstances. We also believe that it is critical to try to establish confidence building and crisis mechanisms to deal with inadvertence and miscalculation, which I believe in the near term is the biggest risk that we face, in which something like in 2001, the EP3 crisis. I think the challenge now is that something like that, or a ship bumping, or a ship or an airplane downing, in the past, those may have been seen almost as isolated events. We are now part of a larger forward deployments. We're at higher levels of alert. And so you could easily see circumstances where inadvertent escalation came to play. We're seeking to avoid that, to take steps to ensure that the operators and other strategic interlocutors have a chance to engage directly. I think ultimately we'd like to have discussions about doctrine. We have sought a strategic dialogue with China for years on nuclear matters. I think China has been reluctant to have any discussion that would in any way suggest that they're prepared to limit a dramatic increase in their nuclear arsenal. But it's possible they may be prepared to talk about other issues around nuclear issues. We have had an initial discussion on AI. I think both nations understand on some level some of the challenges that AI presents to military command and control, particularly in the nuclear arena. And so I think the idea here is to have careful, very well-focused dialogues, which frankly we share the output and our initial objectives with key players on Capitol Hill and with our partners, and to try to use these mechanisms to improve communications and reduce misunderstanding and risk. And I think those are prudent and effective. I'm not sure whether in a crisis they will be decisive, but we have certainly taken the steps to build some of these mechanisms as we go, and China has been participating in some of those efforts. I think in the past, and it has been well noted, that we built some of these mechanisms before, but then in moments of crisis when we've sought to use them, phones have rung, on in empty rooms without being picked up. Mechanisms that were established were not fielded. And so these have to be seen as real and having institutional viability. They can't be seen as simply public elements of public diplomacy, which have no utility in a crisis or a challenging moment. And so our goal is to make them relevant, Chris, to do what we can, and to use these careful lines of strategic communication to advance American purposes.
Try and squeeze
one.
Take
a couple more. We'll probably take two more.
Two more? Okay.
If we can, then I'll do.
Way in the back there. A woman with her hand up.
Sorry.
There we are. Thank you.
Zhang Cho with the Voice of America. Senator Roger Wicker last week, in the aftermath of Putin-Kim summit, said that U.S. needs to consider redeploying U.S. tactical nuclear weapons to the South Korea. Also, Alison Hooker, former NSC Senior Director for Asia, said that North Korea and Russia are driving South Korea to get their own nuclear weapons. Do you think additional measures are needed at this point, other than Washington Declaration, in order to strengthen nuclear deterrence on the Korean Peninsula for South Korea?
So thank you for the question. I think that the mechanisms that we've put in place between the United States and South Korea, you talked about the Washington Declaration and the strategic initiatives that have been launched to underscore the added significance of American extended deterrence, particularly in situations like Korea, I think has given us what we need to work with. Now we just have to be purposeful on following through with the specific steps in the declaration. I do believe that in the aftermath of the Washington Declaration, there was an appreciation of Korea of the American intent to stand by our allies and partners and to make clear that the nuclear umbrella is strong and durable over Northeast Asia. I do agree with Allison, though, that the steps that Russia and North Korea are taking are causing countries in the region to rethink all of their military and other steps. And so what we've seen is substantial increases in military spending, different focus in South Korea, in Japan, elsewhere across the Indo-Pacific more generally. And the United States is quite focused on underscoring the strength of our extended deterrence commitments to the countries of Northeast Asia, Japan and South Korea in particular.
Last question. They're just on the side.
John Gannon. John Gannon, formerly of the CIA and Georgetown University.
Not working.
Okay. Currently, we have about 300,000 Chinese students in our universities, including our major research universities. They became quite controversial during the previous administration in the China Initiative, where I think some damage was done to that program. What is the current view? The State Department has a lot of influence on it, and also the administration itself. What is the view in the future of that program in terms of the way the administration wants to see it? Thank you.
Yeah. So first of all, I do think some level of people-to-people or society-to-society engagement between the United States and China is important and necessary. Frankly, I'd like to see more American students studying in China to learn more about its culture, its politics. And so, John, you talked about the numbers from China. What we've seen really is a collapse of the numbers from the United States to China. That is primarily the arena where the State Department plays, excuse me, its largest role. And we've tried to encourage carefully and responsible the increase in numbers accordingly. I think there's been careful attempts now across most American universities to support continuing higher education, but to be careful about the labs, some of the activities of Chinese students. I do think it is possible to curtail and to limit certain kinds of access, and we have seen that generally, particularly in technological programs across the United States. It is also the case, frankly, I would like to see more Chinese students that are coming to the United States to study the humanities and social sciences, not particle physics. I also believe fundamentally that as we look to step up the numbers of people, John, that go into STEM-related activities, and there are not enough Americans, and we're going to need to recruit more and more people internationally to support those programs. Ultimately, some have suggested the only source of that can be China. I would resist that recommendation. I believe that the largest increase that we need to see going forward would be much larger numbers of Indian students that come to study in American universities on a range of technology and other fields more directly. I do think, though, John, and you have a lot of wisdom and experience in this, there are going to continue to be links between the United States and China. And I think the United States has to be purposeful about how we do this. We do not want to create an environment where there are no connections between our two countries. And even though most of the focus has been on what's happened in the United States, I would simply underscore for you that it really has been China that has made it difficult for the kinds of activities that we would like to see sustaining. I can't begin to tell you how many American executives, philanthropists, and others are more wary about long-term stays, worried about, whether continuing activities and programs in the mainland either make strategic sense or whether, they're considered, they continue to be safe. So ultimately, I believe we have taken prudent steps. President Biden has talked very carefully about the China initiative. And I think we've taken steps to send a clear message that in a number of areas, we do support continuing engagement between the United States and China, which we believe is in our best interests.
I can't think of a better way to launch the China Strategy Initiative than to have Kurt Campbell. We're incredibly fortunate for him to spend time with us today. We're even more fortunate that he spent so much of his life and his strategic mind and his capacity to get things done to strengthening America's role in the world. Please join me in thanking Deputy Secretary.
Can we just also can I also just ask if I can, since I would like to see it while I'm here, can we say thanks to Mike and to Rush? When we talk about sustaining American purpose in the Indo-Pacific, it is actually programs like this that play an outsized role. I'm thrilled. If you look at their program, if you look at the team that they're assembling, this is truly exciting. And so frankly, it is my honor to be here. Their work will far outlive anything. Let's say thank you to Mike and Rush.